At the family cookout, I accidentally brushed against my husband's son. He jerked backward like I'd struck him and shouted, "Don't ever lay a hand on me again!" Before I could even open my mouth, my husband looked straight at me and said, "Say sorry to him or you can leave." The chatter around the picnic tables vanished so completely that I could hear the hiss of hamburgers dripping onto the grill. Every head turned toward me. His sisters froze with paper plates in their hands. His mother stared as if she had been expecting this moment all along. My husband's son folded his arms, wearing the smug expression of someone who knew exactly how the story would end. I replayed the last 2 seconds in my mind. I had been carrying a bowl of baked beans through a crowd of laughing relatives. Someone bumped my shoulder from behind. My elbow barely grazed his arm. That was it. No shove, no anger. Just an ordinary accident swallowed by an extraordinary performance. Yet there I stood, suddenly transformed into the villain. I looked at my husband, silently begging him to notice what had actually happened. We'd been married for 6 years. 6 years of birthdays, hospital visits, mortgage payments, and promises whispered across dark bedrooms. Surely he knew me better than this. His face never softened. "Apologize," he repeated louder this time. Not because I was wrong, because keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth. The afternoon sun felt strangely cold against my skin. Smoke drifted through the yard, carrying the smell of charcoal and sweet barbecue sauce, but all I could taste was humiliation. Children stopped playing. Even the music from the portable speaker seemed painfully distant. I realized something in that endless, silent moment. No one was waiting to hear my side. They were waiting to see whether I would submit. I set the untouched bowl carefully onto the picnic table. My hands were perfectly steady, even though my heart wasn't. I looked once more at the man who had promised to stand beside me through everything. Then I simply turned around and walked away. No shouting, no tears, no scene. Behind me I heard a few whispers, then laughter, then nothing at all. They thought they had watched a woman storm off in defeat. They had no idea they had just witnessed the quiet beginning of the worst mistake they would ever make. My name is Claire, and by the time that cookout happened, I'd spent 6 years trying to convince myself that love was supposed to feel lonely. I married my husband, Daniel, after believing we had built something steady, a partnership where respect mattered more than appearances. Looking back, I realize I was the only one treating it that way. Daniel's son, Mason, was 16 when we married. I never expected him to see me as a mother. I simply hoped we could become two people who respected each other under the same roof. Instead, every kindness I offered became another opportunity for him to test how far he could push me without consequences. At first, the insults were small enough to dismiss. He ignored me when I spoke, rolled his eyes whenever I entered a room, and accidentally left me out of family photos. Each incident was explained away as teenage attitude, and every excuse came from Daniel. Whenever I tried to explain how isolated I felt, Daniel would sigh before reminding me that Mason had been through a difficult divorce. Somehow, every conversation ended with me apologizing for expecting basic courtesy. The rest of his family followed Daniel's lead. If Mason interrupted me, they laughed. If he mocked something I cooked, they called it harmless teasing. If he rewrote a story to make me look unreasonable, no one questioned him because believing him was easier than listening to me. The hardest part wasn't Mason's behavior. It was watching the man who promised to protect our marriage quietly, protect everyone else's comfort instead. I stopped defending myself because every attempt only made me seem emotional while everyone else appeared calm. They mistook my silence for weakness. What they never understood was that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's observation, sometimes it's patience, and sometimes it's the space a person needs before making one decision that changes every relationship. In the room forever, after that afternoon, I stopped looking for dramatic confrontations because our family never worked that way. The sharpest wounds arrived quietly, wrapped in smiles and polite conversation. Mason had learned that open cruelty could be challenged, but subtle disrespect could always be dismissed as a misunderstanding. At dinner, he would wait until everyone had complimented the meal before asking if we had anything else to eat. A few relatives would chuckle into their glasses while Daniel lowered his eyes and pretended not to notice. When holiday photos were taken, Mason always managed to step between Daniel and me at the last second. Looking at those pictures later, I seemed less like a wife and more like someone who had wandered into the frame by mistake. Daniel's silence became its own language. He never joined the jokes, but he never stopped them either. Sometimes I caught his eyes meeting mine across the room, lingering for a heartbeat before drifting away. Those brief pauses hurt more than harsh words because they told me he understood exactly what was happening and still chose comfort over courage. So I began paying attention instead of reacting. I noticed who exchanged knowing glances, who smiled when I was interrupted, and who only spoke kindly when they wanted something from me. They believed I was becoming smaller with every slight. In truth, I was becoming impossible to surprise. And once you stop expecting fairness, you begin seeing every betrayal with remarkable clarity. The week after the cookout, Daniel acted as though nothing important had happened. He asked whether I had paid the electric bill, reminded me about a dentist appointment, and complained that we were running low on coffee. Not once did he ask why I had left, or whether standing alone in front of his entire family had broken something inside me. That was the answer I had been waiting for. It wasn't the accusation at the cookout that changed me. It was everything that followed. A man can make a terrible decision in the heat of a moment, but when he has days to reflect and still believes he did nothing wrong, that decision becomes part of his character. One evening, while Daniel was watching television, I opened the hallway closet to put away a blanket. A small metal box slid from the top shelf and landed at my feet. Inside were copies of every financial document connected to our marriage, bank statements, mortgage records, insurance policies, and retirement accounts. I realized I knew far less about our finances than I should have, simply because I had trusted him to handle everything. I carried the box to my desk and spent hours reading each page in complete silence. The more I uncovered, the calmer I became. There were no shocking secrets waiting inside, only a simple truth. I had contributed far more to our life together than anyone, including Daniel, seemed willing to acknowledge. For the first time since the cookout, I stopped asking myself how to make them understand. Instead, I asked a different question. What would happen if I quietly removed everything they had, taken for granted, and let them discover its value only after it was gone? That question didn't fill me with anger. It filled me with purpose. I resisted every impulse to act quickly. Anger makes people careless, and I had no intention of making a careless decision. Instead, I treated my own life the way I had always treated difficult projects at work, with patience, documentation, and a clear objective. As a senior operations manager, I spent years untangling complicated systems, reviewing contracts, and identifying risks before they became disasters. The same habits that made me successful in the office suddenly became invaluable at home. I created a timeline of our finances, gathered copies of every document I was legally entitled to keep, and made careful notes after every meaningful conversation. Facts, not emotions, would guide every step. Without announcing anything, I opened an individual bank account for my salary and updated my emergency contacts, insurance information, and personal records. I met privately with a family law attorney, not because I wanted a dramatic courtroom battle, but because I wanted to understand my rights before making a single irreversible move. Knowledge has a way of replacing fear with clarity. At home, nothing appeared different. I still made dinner when it was my turn. I still answered polite questions with polite answers. Daniel mistook my composure for forgiveness, while Mason assumed the cookout had finally put me in my place. Neither of them noticed that I had stopped building my future around their approval. Every document found its place in a neatly labeled folder. Every important account was reviewed. Every decision was made without threats, arguments, or grand speeches. By the time I finished preparing, there was nothing left to improvise. They believed they had won because I had become so quiet. They never considered that silence can also be the sound of someone putting every piece exactly where it belongs before making the final move. 3 weeks after the cookout, Daniel and Mason returned home just as the sun was slipping below the rooftops. They unlocked the front door expecting another ordinary evening. Instead, they found the house unusually still. The familiar scent of dinner was gone. The framed family photos I had brought into the marriage had disappeared from the walls. My favorite reading chair no longer sat beside the window. The silence itself felt different. On the kitchen island rested a single envelope with Daniel's name written across the front. Inside was a copy of the separation agreement my attorney had prepared, along with a short note in my handwriting. You asked me to leave if I wouldn't apologize for something I didn't do. I finally accepted your offer. This time I'm leaving with my self-respect. There were no accusations, no list of grievances. Every conversation that mattered had already taken place in my own mind. By then, my salary was going into my own account. My personal belongings were in my new apartment. Every shared expense had been documented. Every legal step completed exactly as advised. There was nothing Daniel could undo with an apology offered too late. I later learned that he stood in the kitchen for nearly an hour, reading the same page again and again. Mason, expecting another argument he could dismiss, found only an empty room where my quiet patience had once lived. For the first time, they were forced to experience the weight of absence. Instead of the convenience of my presence, I didn't watch it happen. I didn't need to. Some victories don't require a front row seat. They arrive in the stillness after the door closes. When the people who underestimated you are finally left alone with the consequences of their own choices. The months that followed taught me something I should have learned years earlier. Peace does not arrive the moment you leave a painful situation. It arrives gradually, one ordinary day at a time, when you realize no one is waiting to criticize your every move. My new apartment was smaller, quieter, and entirely my own. For the first time in years, silence felt comforting instead of lonely. Daniel reached out more than once. His messages grew softer with each attempt, shifting from confusion to apology, then from apology to regret. I read every one of them without bitterness. They weren't meaningless, but they had arrived after the moment when they could have changed anything. Respect delayed is often respect denied. I heard through mutual friends that Mason had become unusually quiet. Without someone to blame or dismiss, he was forced to live with the memory of the afternoon that had fractured his father's marriage. Whether he changed because of guilt or simply because life became harder, I couldn't say. That journey belonged to him, not me. As for me, I stopped measuring my worth by the acceptance of people who had never truly seen me. I traveled, reconnected with old friends, and filled my weekends with simple pleasures I had quietly abandoned over the years. I laughed more easily. I slept more deeply. I no longer rehearsed imaginary conversations, hoping someone would finally understand my side. Sometimes people ask whether leaving was my revenge. It wasn't. Leaving was my freedom. The revenge was far quieter than that. It was allowing the people who underestimated me to discover, in my absence, everything my presence had been quietly holding together. They lost the comfort they never appreciated, the loyalty they assumed would never disappear, and the woman they believed would always stay, no matter how she was treated. The day I walked away from that cookout, they thought I was leaving in shame. The truth is, that was the first day I ever walked away with my head held high, and I've never looked back.